Today on Substance Stories, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Fergal Armstrong, and we're going to be wrapping up the spirituality series. Welcome to Substance Stories. I'm so excited today to be reintroducing, welcoming back to the pod, Dr. Fergal Armstrong. It's been a long time, and we're very, very glad to have you back.
Thank you, Rich, for having me back. It's great to be here.
We wanted to do today to sort of do a wrap-up episode on the sort of spirituality series we've done. I know that you are a very spiritual man, so I wanted to hear from you, why is spirituality so important in recovery?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, first of all, before I give you my ideas, Carl Jung famously said to a patient, Roland Hazard III, that the only way that he was going to recover was if he had a spiritual experience. And you and I, we both work in the recovery industry, right? And we've seen people who say the right things, do the right things when they're under our care, have fabulous plans, then they go home and it all collapses. And you and I have seen people who, despite our thoughts to the contrary, have made remarkable achievements and strides in their personal recovery journeys, and we cannot explain this. And I choose to explain this inexplicable thing by the fact that it's, for some people it clicks and some people have a spiritual awakening. I genuinely believe that recovery requires a spiritual awakening. How that manifests, well, that's why we're here today to talk about it, isn't it?
And it came up a lot we had three wonderful people on the podcast, an Islamic scholar and GP who works in addiction, a rabbi who runs an addiction recovery group, a priest who runs an addiction recovery group. And what struck me was that there were a lot of things that they were all sort of preaching from the same hymn book or Torah.
Or Quran or Torah, whatever book you choose to define.
That there was this sense of being true to oneself. And I think that's what I think about with you sort of saying that spiritual awakening is some people, I think we Nathan and I were talking about this on a different podcast a while ago, who are changing identity in recovery and how you have to set your identity around recovery. And I think spirituality and a spiritual awakening is a way to do that, right? It's a way to change your whole self inside and out. And I think you say we meet a lot of people that are doing all the right things, but perhaps aren't under that, changing their spiritual idea of who they are.
Yeah. I mean, you could talk for a long time about identity, personal identity. But why don't you just give us a summary, Rich, of what is identity? Because I know that you are very interested in the concept of identity in various other professional fora that you work in and you're expert in.
Absolutely. So my favorite. Oh, sorry, cutting you off there. Go for it, boss.
Well, I was just going to say, identity is absolutely crucial, and I think people's identity in recovery needs to be well defined. So, how important is identity?
Supremely important, and not just for people in recovery. Identity is supremely important for our lives. My favorite quote on identity is the Kierkegaard quote about the self, which is the self is the relation that relates to itself. It is not the relation that is relating to itself, but rather the relation itself that is relating, or something like that. It's complete gobbledygook, and I love it.
Could you give us a simpler version of what's identity?
I think Kierkegaard said it the best. Look, to me, identity is who we see ourselves as and who we feel ourselves as, and a healthy identity is multifaceted and tells a positive image of who we are and makes sense. That's when I'm looking for people with identity. I want their identity and their idea of who they are to be vaguely positive, because if a story you tell about yourself is a negative one, I think you're in a bit of trouble. I want it to be related to reality, because if you're telling a story, if I'm sitting here saying I'm the Queen of England, I think I'm in a lot of trouble. And I want it to be multifaceted. If my identity is entirely in one thing, and that's what addiction does, it puts it entirely in one thing, then I'm in a lot of trouble. And that's actually something I really keep in mind with recovery. I worry about people that have sometimes an early recovery, or people can get stuck in recovery and their identity can be entirely recovery. And a healthy identity to me is lots of different things. It's my spiritual self, my working self, my relational self, everything. Yeah. That's a healthy identity to me.
So you identify that spirituality is an essential part of identity. And I would argue that spirituality not only is an essential part of identity, but also an essential part of meaning and purpose.
Yeah,
What do you think?
I think, I think, I think it can be. I don't want to go so far as to say it has to be, because I know a lot of people that would switch off at listening to that. But I think
Yeah,
it can be a very important part
yeah,
of meaning and
yeah.
purpose, and it's a great way of finding meaning and purpose.
I think so. I think you've alluded to the fact, actually, and quite rightly so, that a sense of spirituality is not for everyone. There are people who are, from a ideological point of view, atheists, and there are also people who have unfortunately experienced trauma in the context
Mm,
of spirituality or religion, and we have to
mm.
acknowledge that and we have to be sensitive to those stories and narratives, because shoving religion down people's throats is not always a good thing.
Yeah, so that was an exact question I asked all three of my guests. Was what do you say to people that have a difficulty engaging with spirituality and religion due to due to traumatic experiences with the organized religion? And I think my favorite answer was Troy's, the priest, who
Yeah,
apologized and said how much he empathized with those people, and then encouraged them to talk to a good priest, which I thought was a wonderful way. And my takeaway from talking to Troy was he really emphasized connection in recovery, which I thought was a really wonderful thing to emphasize. And the way he talked about human connection, I think he would look on a lot of people that would say, "Oh, I'm not very spiritual, but I feel very connected to my fellow man," as spirituality.
yeah, yeah. So is spirituality simply connection?
It can be.
Could
I think
be.
it can be. It could be a lot more than that as well, couldn't it? And
Yeah,
that's what's wonderful about spirituality. It's a vague, to me, it's this sense, this feeling and knowing inside you, and that can be anything, can't it?
yeah. I think for me, spirituality is a connection with something greater than myself. And I think that speaks to the 12 steps. Step two refers to a power greater than myself that can restore me to sanity. Um, so I think it's really important for people to actually identify something greater than themselves in recovery. And it doesn't, for those who have a problem with, Christianity or even any form of religion within the 12 steps. I mean, the higher power doesn't actually have to mean God or Allah or Jehovah. It can be, I often liken it to a personal accountability to others within the group. How would you think about higher power?
Yeah, I think that's it. It can be. So again, to quote Obadiah, the Islamic scholar who was on, he said, "Well, let's call it peace." And if we're just going to be with this thing, so you can be with peace, is a sort of when I asked him for a practical advice, just to someone that was trying to access a little bit of spirituality in their day, this
Yeah,
concept of being with peace, and I thought that was a beautiful way of putting it. I mean, I think if I'll phrase it, how would I think about spirituality? Well, if in a higher power in recovery as well, when I'm in addiction, I have not, like, I've lost control of my relationship with the substance. So if I'm going to achieve recovery, I need something that I don't have. I need a higher power to take that control. So to me, how would I define a higher power in recovery? It's anything that enables me to regain that control because I've lost control. So it can be anything. It's your own personal definition of a higher power.
yeah, yeah. That's true. That's true. And this is not just wishy-washy. This really is important stuff, and it really does work. I mean, you've seen people make significant changes in their lives and have significant improvements in their mental health when they embrace these concepts.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I think for you, Fergal, I know, and maybe I'm thinking, but to me, I would assume for you one of your higher powers or faiths is service, because I know that's very, very important to you. And I think that's also, there was the Rabbi Slavin who we had on.
yeah.
That's what he kept on going back to, this sense of the need for service and to give. And I thought that would very much resonate with your experiences as well.
Yeah, it does. It does. I personally believe that our greatest purpose on this earth, irrespective of our religious views or spiritual views, has to be service to our fellow man. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I encourage all my patients to do at least an hour volunteering a week. I think it's giving back to our fellow man actually helps us and helps our own sense of self-esteem. And personally, for me, there are times in my busy week when my time that I spend giving back to my fellow man, working in the 12-step program that we run, is the most meaningful time of my week. There are weeks go by when I'm thinking about all the paperwork that I haven't done rather than the patient care that I haven't delivered. And this idea of service being the greatest purpose in man, I think, is reflected in the attitudes of the original founders of the 12 steps. So Dr. Bob and Bill W., they both said that the key to their own personal struggles with alcohol was helping now they use the word alcoholics, but I'll use the phrase patients. So their key to their own sobriety was to help other patients struggling with alcohol use disorder, to help them achieve sobriety. And by that service, they were protecting their own identity and they were protecting their own recovery.
Yeah. And do you think that service itself and giving can be a form of spirituality?
So I have some colleagues who are Buddhists, and they feel that they can put meaning into any activity that they do. And so they fill their daily lives with a sense of purpose and meaning. And I have heard it said that we can put meaning onto any activity that we choose to. I mean, what would you say to that from a psychiatric point of view?
Absolutely. The practice of mindfulness and being present in the moment and introducing conscious thought into what is usually sort of automated processes is incredibly meaningful. And, I'm a huge fan of mindfulness, and it's where I try to access that part of myself, that spiritual part of myself.
Yeah.
But it can be tricky, especially in today's world, to try and, I think we live in a very secularized world, and it can be hard to find that sort of spiritual side of yourself.
So given that we are living in such a secular world, how would you advise a patient to be more spiritual?
So I think there's a few things. I'd try to be open to the experience, full stop. Try to practice meditation every day, and try to find more purpose in your life would be my threefold. And that purpose can be human connection, it can be raising a family, it can be an art project, it can be work, anything that you find fills your cup. And that's how I try and find spirituality as a fairly unspiritual man. But you've got a lot more spirituality. How do you find spirituality?
Well, I mean, I believe in God. I mean, that's fundamental to my sense of spirituality. But I am aware that my belief in God is my belief in God, and belief in God is really dependent on your context, where you're born and who you're brought up by, and the exposure you're given as a child. So I don't believe that my God is everyone's God, but I do believe in regular. I mean, if we're moving aside from spirituality, I do actually believe that regular church attendance or regular attendance for observances, might be at a synagogue, be at a mosque. I do believe that these are very evidence-based interventions that actually have a positive effect on recovery and mental health. So we know that people who go to church weekly, that they have a 30% reduction in the risk of smoking and 30% reduction in the risk of alcohol use disorder. Going to church at least once a week is inversely related to severity of depression, anxiety, hopelessness, and loneliness. And these all feed into the risk of recovery, because if you're not feeling well, if you're not feeling connected, if you're feeling anxious, depressed, and lonely, well, you're halfway to a relapse. So, we've got good evidence that simply going to church reduces the risk of some substance use disorders and actually improves mental health. But again, church isn't for everyone. So I think we need to be as wide as possible in our concepts around what is religious observance and what is spirituality.
And I think, the 12 steps do, especially a more secular one, do occupy that role of connection and weekly habit for someone who is an atheist. You can find a group that is also quite atheistic and then attend and have that same connection, have that same benefits and that same connection to spirituality. And that's why we're such big fans of the 12 steps.
But church and the 12 steps, it's not just about this idea of a belief in God. I mean, I think if you think about, going to church once a week, what does that mean for you as in your life? It means that you're connecting with other people who are sober and you're receiving a message of love, and you're encouraged to connect with people on a deeper emotional level, and you're probably going to then get involved in volunteer work. Again, so there's a range of fringe benefits to weekly church attendance that I think contributes to recovery.
Fergal, thank you so much for joining. I hope that this religiosity, spirituality series was as helpful for others as it has been for me. I hope having you back on the show was as pleasant for others as it has been for me. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fergal. Thanks, everyone, for listening.